Hello and good morning. My presentation this morning will, I hope, reveal to you the rich and surprising natural and built interest here in Bishop's Castle Churchyard. Most of you probably already know a great deal about the place and those commemorated, but hopefully you may find something new in my talk which will inspire a visit and perhaps some further research. So we'll begin. The churchyard here is an ancient and sacred piece of ground. It's part of the town that has remained almost unchanged for generations. It's a setting for the churchyard and the church, and in this hallowed ground, mostly in unmarked graves, lie the remains of men, women and children who made the community the place it is today. For most of them, their only memorial is the green sward of the churchyard. In fact, Oliver Rackham, in his book, The History of the Countryside, says that in an old rural churchyard, there may be up to 10,000 burials. The more recent visible stone monuments, like this fine Georgian tomb we see here amongst the flowers, mainly date from the 17th century onwards. Before this, there would have been very little in the churchyard apart from the grassland. Apart from disturbance by grave digging, the grass here has been here for centuries, unspoilt by agriculture and chemical use, becoming a living sanctuary for wildlife. And by wildlife, I mean plants as well as animals. Some are now rare in the wider countryside. The churchyard is primarily a consecrated place set aside for burials and the interment of ashes, and sensitive care of the habitats make it a more pleasant place for quiet reflection and remembrance. It was the 19th century poet Longfellow in his poem God's Acre, where he says, "I love the ancient Saxon phrase which calls the burial ground God's Acre." Perhaps it was this poem that brought the phrase God's Acre into common use. It's suggested, however, that St. Cuthbert, the Northumbrian saint, obtained permission from the Pope to allow burials around churches and for them to be consecrated. Here's St. Cuthbert, and at his feet you can see two beautifully carved ducks, eider ducks, cuddy ducks, or St. Cuthbert's ducks as they were known. He gave them sanctuary from persecution on the Farne Islands in Northumbria, making him one of the earliest wildlife conservationists. Returning to our God's Acre, the first church recorded here was built around 1291, and here's a picture dated about 1790 from the south side. And because of its position at the bottom of the hill, rather than the top of the town by the castle, coupled with the fact that it's on the ancient Kerry Ridgeway, makes it quite possible that there may have been an earlier chapel or shrine here used by travellers. If this is indeed the case, then the site would have been a sacred space for well over 1,000 years, indeed from around the time of Cuthbert. We enter through the Lich Gate. Records show a previous Lich Gate here described as a ruinous old fabric, which local people called the Callants, a derivation of scallange, an old word for Lich Gate. Scal is the old word for slates, and henge is a construction. Hence we have a construction which has supported a roof of slates, a scallange. Most lich gates were built to look old using medieval type joinery. This one has 4 gable ends and dates from 1894. And it's gone from being described as a ruinous old fabric to a sumptuous structure. And it is said an immense congregation attended its dedication. But there's disagreement as to the wood that was used. One source suggests eki from the redwood ironwood tree. It's very hard wood and it grows in southern Africa. Another source suggests teak. The word teak originates from Tamil word teko, and it sounds a bit like eki, so obviously there's been some confusion here and it needs some further research. As we enter through the Lich Gate, there ahead of us is the War Memorial Obelisk, which plays an important part in Remembrance Sunday each year. It dates from 1921, which is almost 100 years old now, and it's dedicated as a memorial to the men of Bishop's Castle who died in the Great War and the Second World War. It was unveiled in 1921 by the Countess of Powys, that you can see here. You see everybody with their umbrellas up. It rather reminds me of the Remembrance Sundays we have these days when it's pouring with rain. The memorial is made of Hollington stone, which is a type of sandstone, and Hollington is a village in the Staffordshire Moorlands. And in fact, it was Hollington stone that was used to build the new Coventry Cathedral that was built in the 1950s. There are also 5 Commonwealth war graves. This is one on the left. 2 dedicated to soldiers from the First World War and 3 dedicated to soldiers from the Second World War. They're all made of Portland stone, which is a very hard and beautiful limestone, which is quarried on the Isle of Portland. And in fact, Buckingham Palace is made of Portland stone also. I love the emblem of the King Shropshire Light Infantry that we see on the top of the stone here with the bugle and the 3 squared bows. On the right, we've got another grave commemorating someone who died in the First World War. It's not actually a Commonwealth war grave, but it commemorates a soldier who died from wounds received in France. It's a beautiful Gothic style memorial with painted Union Jacks. It's actually marble and it's 103 years old, but in fact it's in very good condition for its year because marble is very susceptible from weathering by things like acid rain and polluted air. Staying with geology, there are more rock types here than anywhere else in the parish. The earliest monuments, and we see one here, which is 256 years old, are made from fairly local old red sandstone because transport was difficult. The railway didn't arrive here until 1865. Making it easier to bring in the coloured granites and marbles, which became fashionable. This is pink Aberdeen granite. And in the 19th century, the industry expanded and Aberdeenshire became a world-renowned producer of granite. More recently, we've seen stone from around the world, from India, China and South Africa. Popular is the black gabbro that we can see here. It's often called black granite, but it's not actually a granite. I've got another view of the new part of the graveyard here, where seeing all the line of stones facing east, and also a shot of the area for the interment of ashes. I like this picture, and it's got the beautiful hedgerow behind and a very interesting characterful shed. And when I visited a year ago, ready for the talk that was going to happen a year ago, this is what I found against the oil tank. So what I think is, if anyone's here from Caring for God's Acre, they should add reindeer to the species list of wildlife found in the churchyard. And I'll mention reindeers again later. So the geology of the Victorian church, completely built in 1861, is interesting. The body of the church is the same grey rubble siltstone as used elsewhere in the town, but the surprise is the Shelley sandstone used in the quoins, buttresses and string courses. This is believed to be Permian limestone from South Yorkshire, and the same stone used in the 1830s to rebuild the Houses of Parliament. The local geologist, Andrew Jenkinson, suggested there was a connection with Viscount Clive, Earl of Powys, patron of the church at the time and a member of the House of Lords. Was there leftover stone from the Westminster job, or did Clive suggest he knew a good source for the rebuild? It's an intriguing mystery as to how stone from so far away got here. After all, the Bishop's Castle Railway wasn't opened until 4 years after the church was rebuilt. The National Heritage Lottery Fund is supporting the Georgians in Stone project, which today is a part. as was the research by volunteers from Bishop's Castle Heritage Resource Centre into the lives of the men and women who were commemorated by the 12 Grade 2 listed Georgian tombs, which are being conserved as part of this project. And it's a shame that we can't see this wonderful exhibition today, but no doubt you'll have a chance later on in the summer to view this. The conservators of the 12 Grade 2 listed tombs in the churchyard are Kieran Elliott and Sue Ryder. We can see them here. Kieran said, "Each stone memorial had its own problems, and dismantling a tomb is always a last resort. And in conserving the tombs, the team sought to maintain their value by keeping the original form and architectural elements. Conservation is not restoration. In conservation, the maximum original material is maintained, so these stones won't look like new." The memorials are all sandstone ashlar. Sandstone is the material and ashlar is the very old type of construction used, a thin, squared and dressed stone masonry, as you can see here. In fact, the Wollaston tomb, in this picture, the ivy had damaged the top, so a new top is being made for this by Macmillan Masonry of Libotwood. Here's two further tombs, the Thomas tomb, a wonderful fine pedestal tomb, and the quite famous African's grave. The positioning of this tomb is very curious. It's being turned away from the other graves in the area, facing towards a yew tree. The inscription is hidden from general view. Giving cause for concern was the lamination, as you can see here on the slide, the bottom. This could readily fall away with the loss of perhaps the most important area of lettering. Conservation has stabilised this, and a wonderful new wooden cover been made to keep the stone safe in winter. Here are the rest of the 12 memorials, and I'd just quite like to mention the one on the left, the Toldeby tomb. You can see it's all collapsed on the ground. Well, it's now been reconstructed using this original material, and it's a wonderful example of what conservation can achieve. What a fine Georgian tomb it is. It's straight out of a Jane Austen novel. In fact, Jane Toldeby, commemorated here, could have been one of her characters. Behind you can see the listed wall of the old church, and if we look at it from the other side, from the south side, you can see here what the Historic England Grade 2 listing has to say about it. All the churchyard monuments are important, not only these Georgian monuments. They're worthy of care for their historic interest, and because this history gives us a sense of time and place. And we'll have more about monuments after my talk from Professor Harold Mighton. I'll just show you a couple from our churchyard that I particularly like. This is one of the earliest, and it's 257 years old in amazing condition. I walk past it as I enter to go to the bell tower to do my bell ringing and look at it every time. It's a wonderful monument. And I feel it echoes the sentiment expressed by Thomas Gray in his poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, 12 years prior to this, where he meditates on the variety of ambition and looks at death as a leveller, which makes no distinction between the famous and the unknown. Sue and Kieran Elliott, the conservators, discovered that a few of the older tombs, and this is one of them, the older stones, and here we see this one, are incredibly beautifully carved and very fine work. And Kieran said there must have been a very highly skilled letter and pattern stone cutter living locally at a time when there were very, very few around, because the stone here is very variable, but the person who carved this has made a wonderful job of it. This commemorates a woman called Mary Palmer who died aged 36 in 1849, and you can read part of her epitaph here. It's very sad reading, and it shows one thing I noticed with some of these is people had a very short and painful life, and it made me consider the what we're going through today and the pandemic. And I did some further research to see what was happening in this time when Mary Palmer died. And in fact, the smallpox vaccine had been developed rather, 53 years before she died. But there were also other terrible illnesses around those times, typhus, cholera, TB, in fact. So life was tough, much tougher than we see today. So moving on, oh, and incidentally, genealogy and family history is very important and interesting to many people. And in 1991, the local WI did a survey of the inscriptions and the gravestones, and that information is available in the church and the Heritage Resource Centre. But now the church building and all the stonework in this churchyard mimics natural rock face in the wild. And it's important for lichens, mosses and ferns. And I'll just show you a few. This is the beautiful, delicate, brittle bladder fern, or common fragile fern, and it's found on the north wall of the churchyard. It grows in shady, moist areas, and it's abundant through Scotland. So what it's doing here, who knows? But it's a perennial plant, so it dies back and regrows each spring. We've got the beautiful yellow corydalis, a pretty flower originally from the foothills of the Alps, in fact, growing on stonework in the Alps. It's interesting because the ripe seeds have a white, fleshy, fatty structure on them, which attracts ants, which then transport them back to their nests, eat the fleshy bit and discard seeds, which then are lodged in the stone, and of course another plant grows. It's an interesting method of seed dispersal by ants. We also find a variety of bryophytes. These are mosses and liverworts. They're small flowerless plants. We've got 6 different sorts in our churchyard, and here we see the rough stark feather moss. They just typically form dense green clumps or mats. And here we see on this angel, she's got a beautiful mossy hairdo, and you can see this little gravestone opposite the African's grave. Liverworts can also be found. They grow on the surface of soil where its drainage is poor, and they have tiny overlapping leaves, scale-like leaves, and resemble miniature ferns. So moving on to lichens, the great age and variety of the stones here allow colonisation by slow-growing lichens of all colours. They can take over 100 years to grow only a few centimetres. And the survey in 2006 identified 67 species. And they're actually a combination of 2 organisms, a fungus and an algae, growing together to their mutual advantage. I just run through the 3 main types of lichen because they're churches are so important for lichen conservation. They look nothing much, but they're very important. They used to be used in the dyeing industry, and in fact they still are today in the Hebrides used for dyeing wool. They also contain antibiotic properties, so they would have been used years ago for healing wounds and for making poultices. And of course birds use them for lining their nests. Here we see one of the 3 varieties, the crustose or crusty lichen. These look like splashes of paint, and they're very difficult to remove. Next, we've got the foliose or leaf lichen. This is unusual in the fact that it's got an English name. They're mostly Latin names. So this is one of the 67 in our churchyard. And thirdly, we've got the fruticose or bushy lichen that we can see here, that doesn't often grow on stonework, but mostly on trees. But we have a vast congregation of wild plants and creatures here in this churchyard. The birds, mammals, reptiles and amphibians, the bumblebees and butterflies, which have all been here for centuries and are memorials every bit as historic as the stonework. And there's considerable threat to wildlife all over Britain. But the growing awareness of the role burial sites can play in nature conservation will hopefully mean that in more places, plants and animals will find a safe haven or a living sanctuary. When it comes to small mammals, the taller grassy areas are a haven for mice and voles. Hedgehogs probably visit and forage in the churchyard as part of a wider territory. They've become endangered, and these sites are very important. Talking of mammals, there's very little evidence of bats here, but being a bell ringer, occasionally we do get a bat flying around in the belfry, but they don't stay long. They don't like the sound of the bells. The churchyard has the three things that bumblebees need to thrive: old mouse holes for nest sites, early nectar for the queen, and later flowering plants for the worker bees. Other invertebrates here include many types of fly, bugs, ladybirds, grasshoppers, butterflies, and the damselflies we can see in this picture. Amphibians and reptiles, common frog and toad, have been seen here, and they only need ponds for breeding. The rest of the time they find refuge somewhere where they can find food and shelter. Slow worms, or legless lizards, which give birth to live young, churchyards are very important for their conservation. They love churchyards because they're undisturbed, and they have wonderful stone sites for basking where they can warm up. But the main habitat in any churchyard is the grassland. And the ancient, unploughed, unsprayed grassland in this old site is a relic of the grassland that existed perhaps 1,000 years ago, having only been disturbed by grave digging. The community of plants has taken many years to establish, and we can see here the summer flowering plants of traditional old meadows, of which we've lost 97% of these meadows in the last 70 years. So old churchyards are a very important refuge. I'll just quickly run through a few indicator plants of old meadows, and we've got the common cats here, a beautiful little pale lemon flower with greyish bracts, that's found here. Another one are the bird's foot trefoil, which you can see, or eggs and bacon, you may know it as. It's here, you can see it on this grave, along with lady's bedstraw. Now, the yellow lady's bedstraw is a good example of religious association with plants. Many plants do have religious associations. It's called lady's bedstraw because it was believed that it was strewn on the stable floor where the Virgin Mary gave birth to Jesus Christ. We can also see the ox-eye daisy in this picture, or the moon daisy, because it never closes, it's open and faces the moon, whereas the little daisy we see in grassland, short grassland, the daisy closes at night, which is why it's called the day's eye, the daisy. We've also got here the hedge bedstraw. It's uncommon locally and may well be the only site in the parish in this churchyard where it can still be found. So you can see why churchyards are called sanctuaries. We have early flowering plants too, like the lovely snowdrop or Candlemas bells, again, religious associations. It was thought it was brought in from the Holy Lands by the Crusaders and planted on monastic sites. It's a symbol of purity, and it was picked for February the 2nd to celebrate Candlemas, why it's called Candlemas bells. We have the Lent lily, or wild daffodil. You can see here the English daffodil with its yellow, darker yellow trumpet. These were planted about 20 years ago, all of these, and they make a wonderful site. It just shows you can establish early spring flowers in churchyards. They don't interfere too much with the mowing. Interesting, the scientific name for these is Narcissus pseudo-narcissus, and as you may know, Narcissus is a figure from Greek mythology who was so impossibly handsome that he fell in love with his own image reflected in a pool of water. He later died in despair, and in his place sprouted a flower bearing his name. And this brings me to tell you that There are many of our native plants have got such wonderful stories, mythology and folklore surrounding them, and it's worthy of sort of research in its own right. We've got the wonderful primrose, a cheerful sign of spring that provides early nectar for those bees I told you about, and it's a symbol of eternal love. Moving on, the close-mown grassland here in this old site is a marvellous haven for rare grassland fungi. This is a waxcap, and there are 10 species of waxcap have been found in this churchyard, which is truly amazing because they are extremely unusual and rare, and they only grow on very undisturbed grassland, which has not been ploughed for generations or reseeded, and with no chemical use whatsoever. So we've got that. I'll just show you the scarlet waxcap. We've got the beautiful pink meadow waxcap, or the ballerina. Before the development of the microscope, people wondered what they were. They just popped up overnight. So they thought they were the work of the dark powers until they discovered they were spread by spores. Another one we find in the churchyard is the weeping widow, so called because of the black water droplets that appear on the rim of the cup of the fungus. We also get fly agaric here, said to be the home of fairies. These can cause hallucinations, and in fact reindeers in Scandinavia feast on these fly agaric, which is why you get the idea and the story of Rudolph and the flying reindeers. They've been feasting on fly agarics, and I think this is why our reindeer that was leaning against the oil tank looks so spaced out. It's been eating the fly agarics. Another creature we associate with flowers and meadows is the butterfly. What a beautiful sight, seeing them fluttering amongst the gravestones. And I'm just going to mention my favourite one here, which is the holly blue butterfly. In fact, there are 9 species of butterfly being seen here in this churchyard. This is unusual because it feeds, the first brood feed on the holly flowers. It lays their eggs on the holly flowers, and the larvae feed on the holly flower buds. And then the second brood, later in July, there are no holly flowers, so there's ivy flowers. So they feed on the unopened flowers of the ivy. And this alternating of the larval food plant is unique amongst butterflies. So that's the holly blue, is quite famous. Our churchyard provides nest sites, food, songposts and roosts and places to shelter for many birds, which repay us with their beautiful songs. I'll just mention the spotted flycatcher that you can see here. There was a pair in the churchyard, and we keep our fingers crossed every year that it comes back. It's a summer visitor on the red list for conservation concern. It's become a poster bird for the cause of African migrants, and it's declined massively in the last 50 years. It hunts from perches on low branches or probably on the top of gravestones it would like to settle, while it looks out for passing insects and will deftly fly out and catch the insects. It nests in trees and ledges and in creeping plants like ivy. We've got the wonderful little goldcrest here. They've been seen in the yew trees. It's Britain's smallest bird. Thrushes and blackbirds are very common in churchyards. They're ground feeders. And the swift that we see here, or what's commonly known as the devil bird, because it screams its screeching call. They've tried to attract swifts to the tower with swift boxes. I don't know that they've been successful. Swifts don't like new buildings and new nest sites. They only prefer really old nests. But anyway, even if they aren't nesting here in the churchyard, the insects supplied by this site would be wonderful food for the swifts. Moving on to trees. Trees help to create atmosphere in our churchyard, and we've got a variety of trees. You can just read about for yourself here. The western red cedar can be very long-lived. It grows on the east side of the church. The saguaro cypress, popular tree in parks and gardens. Again, grows on the south side of the churchyard. And of course, I have to mention the English yew trees that grow here along the northern edge of the churchyard. English or European yews are associated with churchyards. They're reputed to be the oldest living things in Britain, growing to a great age. They were revered by our ancestors as the sacred tree of life because they appear to be everlasting. And we have some ancient yews in this country with some interesting histories, and I'll just show you this one at Much Market in Herefordshire. And this is what happens when yews get to be about 600 years old. The action of bacteria hollows them out inside and makes them like a cylinder, which is in fact makes them safer, more pliable. They're not dead or dying or dangerous. They're quite safe. And by the way, this isn't King Arthur sitting in the middle of this tree here at Much Market. We can only guess why yews were planted in our churchyard. They're probably about 500 years old. I did read recently that yew trees were planted on the graves of plague victims in the middle of the 1600s to protect and purify the dead. So I did wonder whether our yews had been planted for that reason, because they'd be about that age, I would say. An interesting idea anyway. So yews are usually dioecious, means they've got male and female trees, but some can be bisexual and some can even change sex. Each seed, as we see here, has a red fleshy outside. It's called an aril. This is the only part of the yew tree that's not poisonous, the fleshy red aril. The rest of the tree is incredibly poisonous, and in fact it contains a poison called a taxine alkaloid, and you only need like 50 grams of needles. If you ate them, you die. So it's that like poisonous. We've also got open water habitat, flowing water habitat in the church, which is quite unusual and a very valuable part of the churchyard. As you can see, it's good for amphibians and also insect larvae. Insects use this for laying their eggs, and the larvae, stay in the water until they come out as dragonflies or damselflies or mayflies or stoneflies. So that's very nice to have. So moving on, in the past the churchyard would have been the only convenient public meeting place, and the activities which took place here may have been seen today as scandalous. For example, in the 14th and 15th century, the churchyard wardens brewed ale to raise funds at certain festive periods. They were called church ale sales. And in fact, it was a parish drinking party. The proceeds helped maintain the church. And in fact, this was again really done again. You can see the top right-hand picture some years ago. Church ales were brewed at the Church Bells pub, and it's being sold here for church funds. In the past, the site would have also been used for sacred dramas and miracle plays. It's a place for taking oaths and settling disputes. We know, for instance, that the game of fives was played here because of the red marker line on the tower. There may well have been wrestling matches, and almost certainly was used for archery practice, because in fact Edward III made it compulsory for butts to be set up in the churchyard after the Sunday service, and for people to practice their archery, not only men and boys but also the women too. But the churchyard is still a meeting place for the community today, as you can see from these lovely photographs, these pictures. We have Remembrance Sunday, Midsummer Rejoicing, and the annual church fete. And of course, in May this year, we will have the celebration of this Georgians in Stone project. But the churchyard doesn't look after itself. The care of the churchyard is undertaken by a group of willing local volunteers headed up by John Howells, that you can see here. He's worked in this churchyard in the most dedicated way for many years. He follows a conservation management plan. And I'd like to stress here that conservation is about careful, sensitive management and not neglect and wilderness. And of all the churches I know across England and Wales, that's quite a few, I would maintain that our churchyard here is one of the most carefully managed for conservation. John's helped occasionally by caring for God's Acres churchyard task team. You can see them here with their scythes. They help with grass cutting and raking. And that's Alex Logan, the leader. And in fact, Caring for God's Acres task team won the Queen's Award for volunteering, and the award was presented in Bishop's Castle Churchyard a couple of years ago. So, to end, our churchyard here may have been an ancient site, have ancient origins, but its importance as a place for burials, for community use, and for quiet reflection, and for the appreciation of the beauty and diversity of nature will hopefully extend far into the future. Thank you. I hope you find that interesting, and now I'm ready to take questions.